I wonder if you've noticed something. No one seems to know what it means to be a man in the modern world. I've spent the last 18 months looking for an answer. I've picked up a lot of books, I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and honestly, I've been frustrated by what I've found. Manhood consistently has been either overdefined or underdefined. On the one hand, I've often picked up a book, and the assumption has been that to be a man is to be a Navy SEAL. That to be a man is to be able to take a plastic spoon and a roll of duct tape and to be able to survive by oneself out in the wilderness. That's manhood overdefined. Not everybody can fit that criteria. On the other hand, I often listen to a podcast and end up being told that being a man is basically just being a leader. And I'm given the most generic principles of leadership to define manhood. Now that's manhood underdefined, because often in those types of talks and those types of books, the principles that apply to men apply equally to women. And so I'm not really told anything distinctive about what it means to be a man. Now, after all of these podcasts and all of these books, I'll be honest, I've spent a lot of time confused, and at moments I've reached a point of near skepticism and wondered if there is in fact an answer to the question at all. Now, what I want to do here is I don't want to entertain, and I don't want to preach. I don't want to inspire, and I don't want to train. I don't want to affirm what guys already believe. Neither do I want to agitate and irritate. I just want to do one thing. I want to try to give men some clarity, an answer to the question, what in fact does it mean to be a man? Here are 5 theses on manhood. We're going to think about manhood generally, biologically. We're going to think about manhood ethically. And finally, we're going to think about manhood spiritually. The first thesis is this: manhood is a gift. Now, there's a modern assumption. The assumption is that human beings are plastic, that we don't have any given form, we don't have any definite meaning, that our identity is just a matter of choice. And it's the extreme understanding of this that has led us to the strange place of women being able to declare themselves to be men, or of men being able to declare themselves to be women. Now let me state something obvious, at least it's obvious, should be obvious to those that have grown up in decent churches. The Bible takes a very different point of view. The Bible tells us that sexuality is not the result of self-creation, but of divine creation. In other words, our sexuality is a gift. I want to think about this gift from 3 different aspects. One aspect is this: it communicates the sense that our sexuality or our manhood is unchosen. I don't know about you, but I'm convinced that the best gifts are not self-selected. I hate gift cards. And I hate gift cards because they're not really a gift. There's no thought. There's no purpose. They're just another decision that I have to make. Now, what we need to realize is the fact that we didn't choose ourselves to be men, it doesn't mean that the fact that we're men is random. It simply means that it's a gift, that someone else has made the decision for us, that our sexuality, our manhood, is a part of the gift of our existence. Psalm 139 beautifully says that God, He formed us in the inward parts. It's suggesting that from eternity He knew us not simply as human beings, but He knew us as men. He decided that we would be men. Now, this is going to be important later on, because we're only going to be able to step fully into the calling that God has given us if we embrace the sexuality or the manhood that God has chosen for us. Here's another aspect of this gift. Manhood is inscribed into the body. Now, the modern world is filled with religious myths. and one of them is the myth of a disembodied identity. We often view ourselves as being a kind of ghost in a machine, that the real me is not my body, it's something that I find within myself. And of course, technology has made it possible for us to change the machinery of the body to suit that mysterious inner self. Now, all of that is a myth. The truth is that we cannot understand who we are without paying attention to what we are. Again, I'll make an obvious point, but it needs to be said. The anatomy of men is different from the anatomy of women. Our physical stature is different. We develop differently. Our chromosomes are different. Our hormones are different. We need to appreciate manhood is not a cultural artifice. It's something inscribed physically into our existence. And again, pay attention to this. It's going to come back in as we think about our calling as men. Now, a third aspect of the gift of manhood is the fact that manhood is meant to be reflective of something. Now, men and women are both made in the image of God, and together they both reflect the image of God. But what needs to be recovered is the truth that manhood reflects something special, something distinctive about God. Once you begin to appreciate this, you begin to see evidence of it all through the Scriptures. It's interesting how carefully the Bible, for example, avoids depicting God as feminine. And this is in striking contrast to the religious environment that Israel found herself in. When you read the Bible, you discover that you could say that creation is feminine. You can say that the people of God, the church, is feminine. You can even, with C.S. Lewis, say that before God, all human beings are feminine. But God is not feminine. God is consistently depicted as the masculine partner when it comes to his relationships with creation and with the church. This is why, or partly why, God is referred to as Father, but he's not referred to as Mother. He's sometimes referred to as husband. He's not referred to as wife. This is part of the reason why Jesus comes in the form of a man, not a woman. Paul seems to be taking this up when he writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7, speaking of man, that he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Now listen very carefully to what I say. I don't want anyone to misinterpret what I mean. None of this indicates that men are superior. None of it is a statement of power or of priority. But it does have to do with relationship. It's so vital to understand that manhood cannot be defined independently. That manhood can only be defined in relationship to womanhood. That there's a kind of connection between the two. That when the two come together, each is able to reflect something in particular. They're not meant to be the same. They're meant to highlight things that are different. Now, in this relationship of man and woman, men pick up and reflect something distinctive about God. We are able to mirror something of God in the roles that we have as husband, as father, and if we find ourselves in the position of being a church elder, in that role of shepherding as well. And all of this is by design. It's part of the gift of manhood that we're created to be able to reflect something distinctive about God. Now, just to make sure nobody misheard me, let me just read a short poem by G.K. Chesterton that makes a point that's so vital to understand. He says this: "If I set the sun beside the moon, and if I set the land beside the sea, and if I set the flower beside the fruit, and if I set the town beside the country, And if I set the man beside the woman, I suppose some fool would talk about one being better. Here's a second thesis. Manhood is a calling. Now, human beings, we're not plants, and we're not animals. Our maturity, it requires education. It requires moral development. Now, written into our body, as I've said already, is a calling. What we need to appreciate is that human beings, that we have a special kind of biology, that we have to be taught and we have to be groomed, we have to be educated into the fullness of our existence. It doesn't just happen all by itself if you feed us and water us like plants. That we have to recognize that there's a particular end or form that we're meant to attain to, and we have to aspire toward that end in order to achieve it. Now, picking up that idea that manhood is written, it's inscribed into our bodies, I want to think about the calling of manhood specifically in relation to just a young boy. What is a boy? What is he meant to become? A few things to think about. 1, a boy is a future husband. It's so important to say this in our modern environment, that part of our calling as men is evident in our sexuality. That male sexuality, our sex drive, it's not a toy that's just to be played with. Neither has God given it to us as some kind of device of torture. It's a gift. That what we learn, especially as we read the early chapters of Genesis, is that male sexuality is oriented toward marriage. And this is the fundamental difference between human beings and other animals. Our sexuality finds its fulfillment not just in the act of reproduction, but in a relationship of lifelong commitment. Now, men need to hear this, because in today's world, so many think of marriage as an afterthought, or they think about it as just one choice among others. Now, there are exceptions. Jesus holds out celibacy as a legitimate calling for Christians. But nonetheless, the general rule is that boys are designed to become future husbands. And this means that one of the great tasks of boyhood and of adolescence and of being a young man is preparing for marriage. Christian sexual ethics, it's not just about abstinence until marriage. It's about training boys to mature to the point at which they can become men who one day can take responsibility for a wife. It's part of our calling as men. Second, a boy is a future father. If sexuality is oriented toward marriage, marriage is oriented toward family. In fact, we can go further and say that the greatest fulfillment of manhood, in most cases, is becoming a father. Now, this is a basic assumption of the Old Testament. Anyone who needs to see it just has to go and read Psalm 128, which pictures a family with children all around a table. And this picture of a man with his wife and his children is the happy life, the good life, as depicted by the psalmist. And this is a general truth that runs through the whole of the Old Testament. What we see even in Genesis is that manhood among the Israelites was distinct from manhood among the other nations. That Abraham, the father of Israel, his greatness was not defined by building projects like Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't defined by heroic exploits like Alexander the Great. And it shouldn't have been defined by sexual conquest, even like Solomon. The greatness of Abraham was twofold. On the one hand, following God. On the other, raising children. And if you read Genesis chapter 18, verse 19, we read how God appointed Abraham to raise those children in righteousness. And so to pass the things of the covenant to the next generation. This was the great aspiration, the great calling of an Israelite dad. And what this means for us is that young men need not just to prepare for marriage, they also need to be trained for fatherhood. Third, a boy should also recognize that he's a future worker. I won't say much here, but it is important to say that any man who behaves like a teenager in his 20s and 30s is unworthy of being called a man. God, he didn't create us to avoid responsibility or to shun work. We see even before the fall that man was put in the garden in order to be, as Tolkien said, a sub-creator with God. That our vocation is to use our gifts and talents to improve the world around us and to nurture those who are under our care. All of this is what has often been called the cultural mandate. Here's a third thesis. Manhood is an inheritance. Now, human beings are cultural animals. We're not birthed into a meaningless world. We're born into a world where language and tradition and custom and family and culture define our existence. There's no way out of that. In fact, if you pause and think of how challenging it would be if each generation had to start from scratch and to think up politics and technology and manners and education and family all on its own, it'd be impossible. Now, that's also true for men, that we're born into a kind of culture of manhood. We're enculturated. Now, this is an important point because men today need to realize that they're living in the aftermath of more than 200 years of cultural revolutions. Let me just in a couple of minutes run through some of the various waves of revolution that have left us living among the rubble of what barely counts today as any kind of tradition or culture. First, there was urbanization. I mean, this happened hundreds of years ago. And what urbanization did is it removed men from a sense of rootedness. They left their villages, they moved to cities, and the end result was also losing touch with a sense of local culture, a sense of local community, a sense of local tradition. The next wave of revolution that hit was industrialization. And this removed men from their homes. It removed men from their trades. It also removed fathers from their families as they went into factories and other locations to work detached from home. A third revolution was capitalism. Now, capitalism did some good things for the world, but one of the negative unintended consequences is it changed men from being producers to consumers. In many cases, men were left with their hands functionally cut off, no longer with the practical skills that they once had. The next wave of revolution was feminism. And what feminism did is it eliminated the role of men from the nuclear family. Now, not everything about the nuclear family was wholesome, but at least men did have some kind of inherited role. And part of the problem of feminism was it discredited that traditional role without replacing it with a new one, which left a lot of men at a loss, not knowing where they belonged in relation to the family. The next thing that hit was the first wave of cultural Marxism. And here we see in the 1960s and 70s and 80s men becoming no longer any kind of emblem of respect or respectability, but instead just being positioned throughout media in terms of comic relief. The dad in every sitcom becomes the dunce, the person you just make fun of. The next wave that hit was digitalization. And here men were alienated from the physical world, they were alienated from embodied friendship, and they were alienated from genuine risk. And lastly, we've had a second wave of cultural Marxism more recently. And with some of this has been the separation of gender and sexuality from the body, such that now manhood just feels like some kind of set of clothing that you can put on or you can take off, but has no definite meaning. Now, I say all of this just to make the simple point that manhood in the 21st century is almost entirely unscripted. It's not tethered to anything biological, social, or spiritual. that over the last several centuries, the Bible's been discredited, tradition's been discredited, and even the body's been discredited. And what this means is all that we're left in terms of defining manhood are the most superficial of stereotypes. That masculinity, it's not just been scrutinized relentlessly, but more recently it's been demonized. And of course, no wonder, in the wake of all of these revolutions, men are so lost and men are so confused. Now, the application for this is something that guys need to grab hold of. We need to appreciate that boys must be inducted into a tradition of manhood. That traditionally all around the world, manhood has been defined not just in relation to women, but also in relation to other men. That in other societies, boys weren't thrown into this artificial setting of peers and left to other teenagers to try to figure out together what it means to be a man. Rather, they were raised in an intergenerational network. In fact, they were taken through rituals. They were inducted into new stages of meaning and responsibility. For example, across the planet, cultures have marked puberty with some rite of passage. And the goal of the ritual was to give young men a sense of location and of identity, to know at what point they transitioned from being boys to becoming men. Now, our culture has diligently worked to erase as many of these rituals as possible. And what's the end result? Well, boys never grow up. Boys never know where they are in life. Boys never graduate as men. In fact, even worse, many of them end up adopting the degrading rites of passage of the culture around them, which in a world like ours often means becoming a man is just losing your virginity, or becoming a man is just humiliating yourself in drunkenness with your friends. If boys don't have real uncles or real grandfathers or real big brothers, they end up adopting toxic figures like Andrew Tate and trusting that they'll be a surrogate big brother to teach them what it means to be a man. Now, the main point of all of this is that manhood needs culture. That sheer biology is not enough to define what it means to be a man. We need tradition. We need fraternity. We need ritual. We need a map. We need an inheritance. And where the world does not provide these things, well, the church must step in. Here's a fourth thesis. Mature manhood is strength disciplined for the sake of righteousness. Let me highlight that word mature. Mature manhood is strength disciplined for the sake of righteousness. Now, men have strength. We have physical strength. Not all of us lift weights, not all of us have equal stature, but generally we're bigger, we're stronger than women. That's not a controversial sport, or rather it's not a controversial point. It's shown through sports repeatedly. But we not only have physical strength, we also have what might be called a kind of emotional spirit. At least that's what the ancient Greeks might call it. Language bears testimony to this. There's an old word, we don't use it that often. It used to be used a lot. Manliness. Men have more testosterone, which means we're more prone to risk-taking. We're naturally more aggressive. This can be a liability. It can also be a good thing. Formerly, men had to step up and be manly and show that strong spirit in critical moments. Now, the thing we need to understand is that men have strength, but strength by itself is not good. And this is why mature men need to discipline their strength for the sake of righteousness. Now, what that means particularly is men need virtue. And there are three virtues in particular that define mature manhood because each of them harnesses strength in the direction of what is good. The first of these is meekness. And meekness is that strength to discipline anger. Proverbs speaks of it being better for a man to be able to subdue his own soul than to be able to take cities. Men were prone to anger. We're prone to outbursts. There's statistics for crime and domestic abuse around the world that corroborate this. We tend to have short fuses. Now, what that means is that meekness is especially needed among men. And meekness is strength under control. Meekness is having a sword, but keeping it in its sheath. Now, let me be clear. Meekness is not weakness. If there is no sword in the sheath, then there is no strength. Men, we need to have a sword, but we need to have the ability to keep the sword sheathed unless it's absolutely needed to be pulled out. And meekness is that strength which is disciplined for the sake of righteousness. Now here Jesus, he is the perfect man. At times we see him turn tables in a spirit of indignation. And yet at other times he sits silently while being spat on and beaten. Jesus, he's never a victim of his own emotion. All of his strength is governed by righteousness, and all of his strength is under control. A second vital virtue for men is chastity. And chastity is that strength to discipline sexual passion. It's not without reason that secular criticism says that biblical sexual ethics are abnormal. They are abnormal for men. The cultural norm is for men to act like bulls. The sexual energy of young men is tempestuous. Anyone who's lived through their adolescence knows how difficult it can be to be able to stay pure and chaste with so much testosterone raging through your body. But a critical part of masculine strength is disciplining sexual passion for the sake of love. In fact, we can say that no man is worthy to be called a man who treats women as consumable objects. Or no man is worthy to be called a man who indulges in the pleasures of sex without accepting the obligations of marriage and of fatherhood. Manliness is not strength out of control. It's strength under control, which means when it comes to the kind of passions that men feel, these need to be disciplined for the sake of love, which is to be, in other words, pure before God. A third vital virtue for men is courage. And courage is the strength to discipline fear. Let me be honest. It's a scary thing to be in a position of responsibility. It's a scary thing to lead a family. It's a scary thing to be summoned forth to protect those who are vulnerable and weak. To be a man is to face fear. And when we face fear, there are only two possible attitudes that we can have. One is cowardice, the other is courage. Nothing is more characteristic of mature manliness than courage. We are not given strength so that our knees can shake and our hands grow limp. We've been given spirit and nerve so that we can be shepherds. And to be shepherds is to care for those who are vulnerable and entrusted to us. When we read our Bibles, we see lots of examples of courageous men. We see Joshua. We see Caleb. We see David. We see the judges. We see the prophets. We see the apostles. We read of martyrs. Manly men are men of strength, but they're men whose strength is disciplined so that it can be used for the sake of meekness, for the sake of chastity, and when needed, for the sake of courage. Here's a fifth thesis on manhood. Spiritual manhood is covenantal leadership. We can look at manhood from different directions. We've thought about it biologically. It's inscribed into our bodies. You can think about it ethically, the kind of special virtues that men need in order for their strength to be governed by righteousness. But we also need to think about the spiritual direction, that spiritually manhood is covenantal leadership. Now, leadership is not a word I've used much in this talk, and that's been deliberate. I think often when we talk about men and manhood, we jump too quickly to leadership. Nonetheless, it is an important concept to think about as we look in our Bibles for guidance about what it means to be a man. Let me just make some observations. Who is it that builds altars in the Old Testament? Who is it that constitutes the priesthood? Who are the elders? Who primarily are the judges, the prophets, and the kings? Who speaks out on behalf of his family and says, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord"? It's men. Throughout the Bible, men are responsible in a special way for the spiritual condition of their families and their communities. In fact, I can say even more, that the spiritual tide of communities, it rises or falls based on the faithfulness of its men. This is where leadership is relevant to manhood. Men who find themselves in these roles of being husband and of father, perhaps being church elders, well, they do have an executive role. They do have an atmospheric role in setting the kind of temperature for the room around them. Nothing influences the spiritual condition of a family more than the spiritual condition of the father. And nothing influences the spiritual condition of a church more than the spiritual condition of its elders. Now, I don't have time to go into all of the qualities that would qualify a man for spiritual leadership. But let me say this. How you walk personally with God determines your ability to be a spiritual leader. Spiritual leadership, it's not a technique. It's not a discipline. It's the byproduct of godliness. Now, this is where I think we're failing as men. If we're honest, in most churches and most homes, women are outpacing men. It's true not just in the secular world, it's true within the church itself. Just recently, I was at a church, and there was a guest preacher who had been an intern with that church 10 years previously. And he stood in the front, and he said something that both warmed my heart and it saddened me. He said that there were lots of wonderful men in the congregation, but it was the women who raised me in the church. Now, that was wonderful because, indeed, it's a great thing to have so many godly women in any church. But that particular congregation had 20 elders at the time that he did his internship. And it couldn't but help sadden my heart as I thought about how could there be so many elders in a congregation with so little mentorship? Why couldn't this guest preacher have said that it was both the men and the women that raised him in his faith? It's so important, especially for those who are in complementarian churches, those that believe that only qualified men can be elders and pastors, that men are truly qualified for their offices. We live in a time where we need men who are truly worthy of being dads, worthy of being husbands, and also worthy of being spiritual shepherds. Spiritual manhood, what is it? It's cultivating the heart and the mind needed to be a covenantal leader. It's all of the fruits of the Spirit worked out in the distinctive existence of a man. Let me end with just a few thoughts on how to train future men. A first suggestion: we've got to be willing to fall out of line with the culture. Now, I live and work in the United Kingdom, and I can say that here, there's an embarrassment about masculinity. It almost just seems that to be a man is itself toxic. We have to appreciate that progressive culture, it's not actually progressing. That we need a better point of view, and we have one with our Bibles. And so in order to move toward the truth, we're going to have to fall out of line with the culture. A second suggestion: we need to talk more about the calling of manhood. Too many guys are wasting their lives following a secular script. What I see is that the guys who are raised in the fancy private schools are no better off spiritually than the guys who are raised in the poor schemes. On the one side, guys are just living for success, which is an idol. On the other side, people are living just for the basest of pleasures, which are also an idol. To serve Molech is not better than to serve Baal. Now, guys, they need to be given a biblical script of manhood. They need to be told what the calling of manhood is. They need to be told about the importance of preparing oneself for marriage, for family, and God willing, if you're given the opportunity, to become qualified even to hold an office within the church. The church needs mature men, and to have mature men, we have to talk about the calling of manhood. Thirdly, we need to situate boys among men. So often youth ministries just repeat the foolishness of the culture around us. We isolate all of the teenagers and separate them from other men. Boys can't be taught manhood from other boys. And so part of what we have to rediscover are rites of passage. We have to discover new traditions. We have to create opportunities for boys to be around an intergenerational network of men and to be graduated into what is the fraternity of mature and spiritual men. And finally, we need more men's discipleship. Spiritual leaders do not develop quickly. They do not grow overnight. It takes investment. It takes training. It takes brotherhood. It takes discipleship. And one of the great problems we have throughout the church is the weakest part of our discipleship ministries is the discipleship that goes on among men. If we want better men, we need to disciple them. And that comes by having a vision and a plan to take men who are spiritual boys still and to grow them up in the paths of godliness.